Everywhere I go, I meet people obsessed with population growth who say, this is the real issue, this is the elephant in the room, this is the thing which is destroying the living world. And it's true that all other things being equal, a higher human population exerts more environmental pressure than a lower human population. And it's true that there are particular issues, particularly some local issues to do with habitat destruction, to do with urban space, which can be strongly affected by population. But to use it as a blanket explanation of all the environmental problems we face, including climate breakdown, including resource extraction, is to grossly misrepresent the situation. The great majority of the world's population growth is taking place in countries where people are very poor, in countries where people make scarcely any contribution to climate breakdown or to resource extraction at all. But what we see is people in rich nations who make a massive contribution to climate breakdown and resource extraction and ecological breakdown, pointing the finger at much poorer people and transferring blame to them, saying they are the people responsible for the environmental crisis which in reality we are primarily causing. Now, this takes on a particularly obnoxious character when you recognise that nearly all the countries in which population growth is continuing in any significant way at all are largely populated by people who are black or brown, people of colour, and that nearly all the finger pointing is being done by people who are white. Rich white people, very often in my experience older rich white people, pointing to much poorer, browner, younger people in other parts of the world and saying they are the problem. There are many ways in which we could, if we chose, transfer responsibility for our impacts and say it's not us, Gov, it's them. We could point to billionaires, for instance, and it would be fairly legitimate to do so because billionaires have much, much greater environmental impacts than ordinary people. Sometimes thousands of times greater, sometimes millions of times greater, with their super homes and their super yachts and their private jets and their super cars. There's massive environmental impacts. There are some people who every day use as much resource and as much fossil fuel as a small African town does. Single people flying in massive jets around the world. We could point to them and say they're the problem. And it would be legitimate to say that as long as we don't also exonerate ourselves. But we can say, yeah, they are the biggest problem per capita. We are also a problem. Wealthy-ish people in the rich world, yeah, we're a big problem. Not as big as the billionaires. But that's not the people we choose to defer the problem onto. No, we're choosing to defer it onto poorer people of colour in other nations and saying they're the problem because they are having too many babies. There is no justification for that whatsoever. And what we're seeing in operation here is racism. It is white people blaming brown people for a problem being created primarily and overwhelmingly by rich white people. And this taps into a very deep vein of racist paranoia, which has been operating now for hundreds of years, where rich white people say, we are being overwhelmed, we are being outbred by them. And they characterize poorer, browner people as being degenerate and inferior. And they're diluting the genetic stock. They're overwhelming us with their inferior genes and their inferior kinds of people. And we're going to be swamped by those people. There's been this deep paranoia about other people, browner people, breeding more than we breed. And that taps straight into the apparent environmental concern about population growth today. It's rooted in a long-standing racist discourse which people completely fail to understand or to acknowledge when they blame other people for the environmental crisis. And this racist discourse has been wheeled out again and again to try to deflect responsibility. A classic example was Winston Churchill in 1943, who blamed the Bengal famine in India, a famine in which 3 million people died, on, to quote, those people breeding like rabbits. He blamed it on people having too many children. The reality was there was plenty of food in Bengal. There was enough food in Bengal. There wasn't even a serious drought in those years in Bengal. But the British, under Winston Churchill, were extracting the food from Bengal and using it to help furnish the soldiers in the war effort. They were taking food away from Bengal to the extent that they caused 3 million people to die of starvation. It was a completely politically generated famine. It was generated by Winston Churchill's policy, but of course he could not admit that, so instead he pointed to the Bengalis and said it's their fault for breeding so much. This as an example of pure Malthusiasm. Thomas Malthus, in the late 18th century, an English clergyman, claimed that it was ridiculous to give people food relief or poor relief because that would just encourage them to breed more, and as a result of that they would be worse off. So we have to be cruel to be kind, we have to cut them off to discourage them from breeding, and that will eventually solve the problem. It would be the final solution for poverty. And this has been picked up again and again by politicians all over the world, particularly in the United Kingdom, but the Nazis were great enthusiasts for that version of history, for that story that was told, but so were a large number of English public figures, and they are to this day. For instance, when the Conservative Work and Pensions Secretary, Ian Duncan Smith, changed the basis of benefits, of social security, economic security granted to poor people, he tried to impose a two-child rule, that we're going to reduce your benefits if you have more than 2 children, because he genuinely believed that giving people benefits would encourage them to breed more, just as Thomas Malthus did. In 2013, David Attenborough, our great hero, our national treasure, gave an interview to The Telegraph in which he said, those Ethiopians, all the famines in Ethiopia, is the result of too many people and too little land. And it's ridiculous to keep giving them famine relief. What's that going to solve? Pure Malthusiasm, and completely irrelevant to the situation of Ethiopia, which at the time hadn't had a famine for 28 years. And the great famine it had 28 years before was caused entirely as a result of political machinations, of people having their land taken away from them, people having their food and their means of subsistence taken away from them, and starving as a result. It was in no sense a result of too many people or too little land. It was the result of exploitation by a ruthless and vicious regime. But instead it was blamed by David Attenborough on the Ethiopian people, and he said that it was stupid to give people food relief because it wouldn't solve the problem. Solving the problem meaning solving the problem in the way that Thomas Malthus meant. So even national treasures fall into this trap of blaming people for the situation in which they find themselves, blaming individual people for structural problems, blaming the poor for the bad things that the rich and powerful do. And all this becomes sharpened by some new research published in 2020 in the scientific journal The Lancet, showing that the demographic transition, the change in the fertility rate around the world, is massively faster than we anticipated it would be, and that we're likely to see peak population now as early as 2064, after which it will start to decline, and that the population is likely to peak far lower than many people claimed. And in fact, before long, many of the world's nations are going to face a real challenge as their populations decline very rapidly indeed, 23 nations will see their populations halve by 2100, and those populations will be overwhelmingly dominated by older people because so few children have been born. And it might become very hard to look after those older people. It might become very hard to generate the money required by those older people. Maybe people won't be able to retire anymore. Maybe there will be no one to care for them. And yet, despite this really transformative new finding, people continue with this story. The problem is people breeding too much. Well, before the pandemic, the global growth rate, economic growth rate, was 3%. That's what really drives ecological destruction and climate breakdown. It's consumption, it's growth. The rate of population growth was 1%. It still is 1%, and it's falling all the time. Now, of course, the pandemic has meant massive economic disruption, but what do governments want to do? They want to get back to 3% growth or more. They want to get that back on track. So people might say, well, yes, but population is a component of that growth, because the more people you have, the greater the growth will be. And so if population growth is 1% and economic growth is 3%, then population is responsible for 1/3 of the economic growth. No, it's not at all. Because the people whose populations are still rising are generally the poorest people on earth who have almost no consumer power at all. And so there's almost no affluence or technology with which to multiply the effects of population. So their impact is a tiny fraction of the overall impact of economic growth. It's a complete misconception that population has an equal impact in different parts of the world. It does not. So some people are saying, well, yes, I sort of accept what you're saying, that maybe the population of poor people elsewhere isn't really the issue, but it's the overpopulation in countries like ours which is the issue. And you say, so what is this overpopulation? Well, people breeding too much, or, well, really, people coming into the country. That's where the problem lies. I am population. They are overpopulation. The over comes from immigration. That's the story. And that's what people are really saying. So often I discover what people are really saying when they're talking about population is immigration. That's what they're complaining about. And they're blaming immigrants for our environmental crises. Now, one of the very interesting things about the demographic transition, about the change in the global fertility rate, which is happening with extraordinary speed, is that before very long, countries will certainly be concerned about population. They'll be concerned about falling population. And they'll be concerned about immigration, not concerned about having too much of it, but about having too little of it, because there won't be anyone to keep the health service going. There won't be anyone to teach the children. There won't be many children to teach. There won't be anyone to look after the old people, unless they're able to sustain the rate of immigration. And so this so-called immigration crisis that we're told we suffer from at the moment is actually keeping the country alive. And when that so-called immigration crisis stops, then we'll see what the real immigration crisis is, not having immigration. And then we'll see that this whole story about overpopulation is actually just a story by which people who were born in this country denigrate and demonize people who were not. What the whole obsession with population is about the denial of our common humanity. It's about othering the people from other nations, people of different colours, people of different cultures, and saying they are overpopulation. We are population, they are overpopulation. They are the problem. And their very existence is a problem. We just want them to go away. We wish they would disappear. We wish those people would not be born, or if they have been born, would be unborn. That is what people are saying. Because actually there's almost nothing they can do about fertility rates. There's almost nothing they can do about population growth in other nations. If you obsess about population growth, you render yourself impotent, because it's not something you can affect. You can affect your own consumption, you can affect your own government's policy. You can't affect how many children a family has on the other side of the world. That's not why people are obsessed by population. They don't want to affect it. They just want to transfer blame, and they want to deny our common humanity. They want to say the problem is the very existence of those other people. And that all ties into the narrative of those other people are coming over here and they are invading us and they are swamping us. And this is how we can demonize people to the extent that we would rather see them drown at sea than grant them safe haven on our own shores.